Sir, I need you to gather your things. Seat 2A is reserved for a real Diamond Prestige passenger, and we need it now." The words dropped into the cabin like something thrown from a height, and every passenger within 4 rows heard them land. The man in seat 2A did not move. His hands stayed flat on the armrests, his back straight against the leather, his eyes forward the way a man holds himself when he has decided long before this moment that he will not be rushed by anyone. His boarding pass was right there on the tray table, printed clean. Seat 2A confirmed paid for 3 months ago on a Tuesday morning when he booked his own travel the way he always did, without an assistant, without a corporate account, without ceremony. Diane Foley stood at the edge of his row, one hand gripping the back of seat 2. B, her platinum blonde hair pulled back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes, her North Star Airlines uniform pressed to a crease that could cut glass. She had the smile of a woman who had already decided what kind of person she was looking at before he ever sat down, and the smile had not improved since she first saw him walk through the cabin door. "Sir." Her voice climbed. She was projecting now, speaking to the whole front cabin, making it a public event. "Mr. Calderton is one of our Diamond Prestige members. We need this seat for him." Behind her, Bryce Calderton stood in the aisle with his arms folded across his chest, a gold watch, the size of a small clock, flashing on his wrist, a cloud of cologne moving with him like weather. He was smirking the way a man smirks when he is certain the situation has already been decided in his favor. Bryce said something under his breath, then something quiet and deliberate, pitched just low enough to give him distance from it later, but loud enough that the woman in seat 1B turned her head a fraction, and the retired firefighter in 3A felt something tighten in his chest. The man in 2A turned his head slowly. He looked at Diane Foley for exactly as long as it takes to make a decision. "Your name," he said, "and your employee number, please." 3 words. 4 words. That was all. Diane Foley's smile froze. Bryce Calderton let out a short, contemptuous laugh, the kind that is designed to diminish and does. Behind them, in seat 3A, a retired firefighter named Frank Delano had his thumb hovering over the record button of his phone. He hadn't pressed it yet, but the thumb was there. And then Diane Foley reached out, took the boarding pass from the tray table, and held it up above her head like a trophy she had just won. Nobody in that cabin yet knew who the man in seat 2A actually was. Nobody knew that in less than 2 hours, a single phone call made from a bench by a window at gate C7 would send a number on a trading terminal in Dallas, falling off a cliff, and that the fall would not stop until $4.8 billion had been erased from North Star Airlines' market value in a single morning. They only knew what they could see: a black man being made to stand up in front of strangers, and a white woman holding his boarding pass above her head as if she had already won. The espresso machine in the kitchen of the 34th floor penthouse made exactly the sound it always made at this hour, a short, controlled hiss, and Elias Grayson stood at the counter in the dark and listened to it, the way some men listen to the ocean, as something reliable in a world that mostly isn't. The city below was still sleeping, 1,000 points of orange light scattered across the dark, like something broken and beautiful. And Elias looked at it, while he waited for the shot to pull, not thinking about the meeting, or the flight, or the North Star CFO who wanted to talk capital injection, and Q4 projections, just standing there in the quiet that belongs to the very early morning, which is the only kind of quiet a man like Elias Grayson gets to have. His phone buzzed on the Marble Island. Raymond Ford, COO, 14 years at his side. He picked it up. "You're up early," Raymond said. "Flying," Elias said. "North Star JFK departs 8:15. Their CFO wants another sit-down about the position. We'll talk on the ground." There was a pause. The particular pause Raymond made when he was about to ask something he already knew the answer to. Why don't you take the jet, Elias? You've got the aircraft sitting there. Elias picked up the espresso. He looked at the city. Because I need to remember what the world looks like from a regular seat, he said, and he meant it in a way that was difficult to explain to someone who hadn't spent 26 years building something from nothing, who hadn't come from a household where a plane ticket was a 3-month savings event, who hadn't watched his mother press her uniform for a job where she was expected to be invisible. If I only fly private, I stop knowing what I'm managing money for. I stop knowing who the world actually belongs to. Raymond didn't argue. He knew when Elias had already made up his mind, and the fact that Elias had been making up his mind this way since the company was 12 people in a rented office in Buckhead was one of the reasons Raymond had stayed for 14 years. Stay close to your phone, Elias said, and ended the call. He dressed the way he always dressed when he flew commercial. Plain navy suit, tailored but unremarkable, the kind that reads as professional without reading as expensive. No tie, no cufflinks, no watch, and this last detail was deliberate in the way that all of Elias Grayson's details were deliberate, because a man who wears a certain kind of watch in public is inviting people to make calculations about him before he has said a word. And Elias had spent the last 20 years making very sure that people in rooms made their calculations after he had said his piece, not before. Single carry-on by the door, MacBook tucked under his arm. That was everything. On the kitchen counter, the Wall Street Journal was folded open to the business section, and in the lower right corner of the page, a small headline caught his eye. Before he picked up his bag, North Star Airlines internal culture audit stalls as Q3 revenue miss widens. He read one paragraph. The language was careful and vague, the kind of language used by companies that want to appear to be doing something while doing very little. He set the paper down and did not finish it. He picked up his carry-on and walked out. Elias moved through priority screening the way he had moved through it several hundred times efficiently, without fuss, without needing to look at the signs, his laptop already out before he reached the belt, his shoes already off, everything in the correct bin, in the correct order. The practiced choreography of a man who travels enough to have internalized the whole ritual. The TSA officer at the metal detector gave him a small professional nod. Elias nodded back and kept moving. At gate C7, the gate agent scanned his boarding pass and paused. Just a half second, her eyes moving from the platinum diamond elite stripe on the card to his face, and back again, the kind of pause that asks a question without asking it out loud. She handed the card back without a smile or a welcome. Elias put it in his breast pocket and walked to a seat near the window, and he did not react to the pause because there was nothing new about it, because he had been collecting moments exactly like that one for as long as he could remember. As he bought a black coffee at the small kiosk near the gate, he tipped generously and said thank you, and sat down with his laptop open, and on the screen there was a document he had been studying for 3 weeks, a detailed analysis of North Star Airlines' passenger complaint records, cross-referenced with their employee performance reviews. He did not read it on the flight. He didn't need to. He had already read it 4 times. When Group 1 boarding was called, he closed the laptop and stood. Diane Foley was at the cabin door checking passes, and she took his boarding pass and turned it over and studied it in the way she had studied it before. The way that is 2 seconds longer than the situation requires, and she looked briefly down the jet bridge behind him as if she expected to find someone else coming, and then she handed it back without greeting or eye contact. Elias walked to seat 2. A put his carry-on in the overhead, sat down, and put on his Bose headphones. Not playing music, just building a wall between himself and the world for the few minutes before the boarding noise became something he had to engage with. He glanced down at his right wrist, bare and unremarkable, and he settled into the seat and opened his laptop and waited. Elias did what he always did in the first 60 seconds of boarding. He read the room, not obviously, not with his head turning, but with the peripheral awareness of a man who had spent decades in negotiations and boardrooms and high-stakes conversations, learning to understand a space and the people in it before the space understood him. Seat 1. B. A black woman in her mid-50s business suit, precisely pressed tablet, already open, headphones, already on the particular quality of stillness around her that Elias recognized immediately and intimately. The practiced invisibility that certain people learn in certain rooms, the posture that says, "I am here. I have every right to be here, and I would like you to make no assumptions about that one way or the other." He recognized it because it was his own posture. He suspected she recognized his. Seats 2C and 2D. A young white couple in matching athleisure, both on their phones, both completely absorbed in whatever the phones were showing them, entirely indifferent to the world around them, in the casual way of people who have never had to think about what it costs to walk into a room. Seat 3. A. A white man in his early 60s, Vietnam veteran cap on his head, reading glasses low on his nose, a paperback novel open in his lap, and this man, Frank Delano, though Elias didn't know his name, yet was not reading the book. He was watching. He had been watching since the moment Elias sat down, since the moment Diane Foley held that boarding pass 2 seconds too long, and looked over her shoulder down the jet bridge, like she was hoping for a different explanation. Frank Delano had spent 31 years as a firefighter in Fulton County, and he had a specific instinct for the moment, before something goes wrong. The particular tension that builds in the air before a situation tips from manageable into something else entirely. He felt that tension now. He felt it in the cabin the way he had once felt heat through a closed door, the signature of something already burning on the other side. He thought about his brother-in-law, a black man, a postal worker, a man who held the door for strangers and always tipped 20% who had been turned away from a hardware store. 3 years ago, turned away from a hardware store from a public business on a public street. For no reason Frank had ever been able to make sense of. Frank had been standing 6 feet away. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't taken out his phone. He had looked at his shoes and felt ashamed of himself for 4 weeks afterward, and the shame had not entirely gone away. He slid his phone out of his shirt pocket camera app open and rested it on his knee with his thumb against the button, and he waited. He came in from the jet bridge, loud and already annoyed, the way some men carry their displeasure like luggage. They refuse to check wearing it in their posture and their voice, so everyone around them understands that something is owed and hasn't been delivered yet. His blazer was expensive and wrinkled, his silver hair slicked back, and the gold watch on his left wrist was the kind of watch that announces itself before the man wearing it does, catching the cabin's amber lighting and throwing it back in a way that seemed entirely intentional. Bryce Calderton did not greet the flight attendants at the door. He walked straight down the aisle to row 2, looked at Elias Grayson sitting in seat 2A, and his upper lip curled in the slow, reflexive way of a man who has just found something where he was not expecting it. "There's somebody in my seat," he announced, and he said it loud enough that the young couple in 2C and 2D looked up from their phones for the first time since boarding. Diane Foley's entire bearing changed the moment she heard his voice. The way a person changes when someone they've been waiting for finally walks into the room. Her posture lifted, her smile became something genuine for the first time all morning, and she stepped past Bryce and positioned herself at the edge of Elias's row, with her hand on the back of seat 2B, her body language forming a kind of barrier between Elias and the aisle. "Sir," she said to Elias, her voice carrying now, projecting deliberately to the full front cabin. "We have a reassignment to make. Mr. Calderton is one of our Diamond Prestige members, and we need 2A for him. You'll need to gather your things." Elias removed one side of his headphones. He looked at her without hurry. "I'm Diamond Elite," he said, his voice quiet and level. This is the seat I paid for. Diane tilted her head, and the tilt was a weapon. Are you really Diamond Elite? She asked, in a tone that made the question into something else, something that wasn't quite a question at all. From the aisle, Bryce Calderton unfolded his arms long enough to make a comment about full fares and the difference between people who actually paid for first class and people who found other ways in. And he said it loud enough for the couple in 2C to hear it clearly, and the woman's scrolling hand stopped for just a moment before she started again. Marion Webb in seat 1B turned her head. She did not look at Elias. She looked at Diane Foley, a long, level look, the look of a woman cataloging something, and then she turned back to her tablet. In seat 3A, Frank Delano pressed record. Diane asked for Elias's ID. He pointed out without any change in his tone whatsoever that she had scanned it at the cabin door 4 minutes ago. She told him she needed to see it again, and he produced it from his breast pocket and handed it to her without argument, calmly, with the steadiness of a man who understands that making a scene serves no one, and that the most powerful thing he can do right now is remain exactly as still as he is. She held the license up. She looked at the photo. She looked at his face. She looked at the photo again, and she made the looking last longer than looking ever needs to last. And the passengers in the front rows who were watching, and they were all watching now, even the ones who were pretending not to, could see the deliberateness of it. Elias Grayson, she read aloud as if the name was a puzzle she was trying to work through, and then she looked up. And how exactly did you pay for this ticket, Mr. Grayson? Was this a personal purchase, or was this booked through a corporate account? Personal, Elias said. She narrowed her eyes slightly. And what kind of work do you do, Mr. Grayson? Because sometimes employers book tickets at a certain level, and there's a tier mismatch, and the passenger doesn't even know, and it causes these kinds of mix-ups. That's not your question to ask, Elias said, and you know it. From the aisle, Bryce Calderton let out a short bark of laughter and said, Just tell the lady friend some of us have a plane to catch, and the word friend landed in the space between them the way the word was always intended to land, when used that way, like a little tap on the chin. Diane leaned slightly forward. We've been having trouble lately, she said, her voice dropping just enough to create the illusion of discretion with passengers who find their way into first class on discounted upgrades that don't quite qualify them for this cabin. I just want to make sure we have everything in order. Elias looked at her for a long, steady moment, and then he said, Pull up my reservation. It's in your system. Everything you need is right there. I'll need to verify through a different channel, she said. There is no different channel, he said. My ticket is confirmed. My seat is 2A. I've answered your questions. We're done. Something moved across Diane Foley's face, then a tightening, a recalibration, and she straightened up and changed her approach, the way a person changes lanes when the current lane isn't getting them where they want to go. Elias took out his phone and began to record. Sir, you are not permitted to record airline personnel, Diane said immediately, her voice sharpening. FAA Guidance 2019 Pikes versus Continental. Elias said, without looking up from the screen. Passengers may record in public areas of an aircraft. You are welcome to call the captain. Diane Foley's smile did not just disappear, it left the building. She turned on her heel and walked to the galley, and in seat 3, a Frank Delano's camera had by now captured the boarding pass, reading the payment question, the upgrade suggestion, the ID being held up like an exhibit, all of it in clean, clear, well-lit footage, the kind that plays well on a 14-inch monitor in a federal courtroom. Behind the galley curtain, Tessa Cole, 24 years old, and in her 4th month on the job, stood with her back against the service counter and her hands pressed flat against the cold metal surface on either side of her because her hands were shaking and she didn't want anyone to see, and because she had been trying to understand how a man with a confirmed first-class boarding pass was being interrogated about how he paid for it, and she could not make the math work no matter how many times she tried. Captain Miles Hargrove was 53 years old and had been flying commercial aircraft for 28 of those years, and what he wanted more than anything else at this particular moment in his career was his on-time departure stat, which was the best in his division, and which he had maintained through 2 hurricanes, a runway incident in Phoenix, and a cabin medical emergency over the Gulf of Mexico, and he did not want a seating dispute in first class to be the thing that finally brought it down. Diane reached him before Elias could, stepping close and speaking fast and low, and what Hargrove heard was hostile and recording staff and refusing the reassignment, and he looked past her at the man sitting in seat 2A with his hands flat on his armrests and his back straight. And then he looked at Bryce Calderton still standing in the aisle with his arms folded and his gold watch glinting. And then he looked at Marion Webb in seat 1B, who was very carefully, very precisely looking at her tablet, and absolutely nothing else. Captain Hargrove chose the path of least resistance. He walked to row 2 and asked in the trained, neutral tone of a man who has performed this function twice already this quarter, whether Mr. Grayson might step into the galley with him so they could sort this out. Elias stood. The whole cabin went quiet, not gradually, but all at once, the way a room goes quiet when something significant has just been decided. Elias reached up to the overhead and took down his carry-on himself, and he did not allow either Diane or the captain to touch his bag, and the sound of the bag's small wheels on the carpet was the only sound in the cabin as he stepped into the aisle. Bryce Calderton did not step aside. He waited until Elias was within arm's reach, and then he stepped, not to the side, but slightly forward, and their shoulders connected, and Bryce did not apologize. And Bryce said something. Then something pitched to carry exactly to the front of the cabin, and no further, the kind of comment designed to land and leave no fingerprints. 4 rows back in a window seat, a boy of about 8 years old tugged on his grandfather's sleeve and asked, in the clear, unguarded voice that children use when they genuinely want to understand the world, "Grandpa, why are they making that man leave?" The grandfather pulled the boy close and pressed his lips to the top of his head, and he did not answer, because there was no answer he could find that he was willing to say out loud on an airplane in front of strangers, and the not answering was itself an answer, and Frank Delano's camera caught all of it. The shoulder, the comment, the boy, the grandfather's silence in steady, unbroken footage. Bryce Calderton dropped into seat 2A with the satisfaction of a man who has just confirmed something he already believed about the way the world is ordered, and he stretched his legs wide into the footwell and settled back into the leather, and signaled to the first flight attendant who appeared, which was Tessa Cole, for champagne. Tessa poured it. She kept her smile in place the way a person holds a heavy tray above their head, with every muscle engaged and nothing to spare, while Bryce made a remark about the cabin smelling considerably better now, and another remark about how some people simply did not understand what first class was actually for. And then he looked at Tessa for a moment, too long, and made a comment about her smile that she was going to write down in exact words the moment she had 30 seconds alone, because she was already planning to remember every single thing that happened in this cabin today, with the kind of precision that holds up in an HR conference room. Marion Webb, in seat 1B, had set her tablet face down on her knee. She was looking at Bryce Calderton now, not glancing, not checking, looking with the full, unblinking attention of a woman who has decided to remember exactly what is in front of her. She reached into her bag and took out a small black notebook, the old-fashioned kind with a hard cover, and she uncapped a pen and wrote several lines in it, quickly and clearly, and capped the pen again and put the notebook away. 3 weeks from now, when a reporter named Nora Ashby at the Atlanta Tribune called to ask whether there was anyone from Flight 114 who could tell her in their own words and from their own recollection what they saw in that first-class cabin on that September morning. Marion Webb would be the first person to pick up the phone, and she would open that notebook on the kitchen table, and she would read from it, word for word. The jet bridge outside gate C7 was all fluorescent light, and the particular smell of recycled air and industrial carpet, and waiting at the far end of it were 2 TSA officers standing with their hands clasped in front of them and their faces professionally blank, and beside them in a North Star ground operations blazer stood Victor Stahl, 8 years in the position, 3 written commendations, and 9 prior complaints from passengers of color, every single one of them closed without action, by the same man who was now turning to look at Diane Foley and asking her for the summary without once looking at Elias Grayson. Diane delivered it. Hostile passenger. Refused reassignment. Recording crew had to be removed from the cabin. Stahl nodded once, the nod of a man who has already made his decision and is just collecting the language to support it, and he turned to Elias and asked him to submit to a secondary screening. On what basis? Elias asked. Stahl did not answer. What's the probable cause for a secondary screening? Elias asked again, his voice the same as it had been in the cabin level, unhurried, without heat. Stahl didn't answer that either. He reached out and took Elias's laptop from the carry-on, held it up to the fluorescent light, as though he were examining a piece of evidence rather than a piece of consumer electronics, and then asked for the phone. Elias handed the phone over, locked, and said he would not unlock it. And when Stahl asked why, Elias said he was still waiting for someone to explain the probable cause for any of this. And Stahl said this was a security matter. And Elias said he understood that. And he asked again. And Stahl walked to a door set into the side of the jet bridge, a windowless service door that Elias had walked past 100 times without ever really registering. And he said, "In here, sir." The room was roughly 10 feet by 12 with bare drywall on all 4 sides, a folding metal chair against one wall, and a fluorescent tube overhead that made a faint electrical whine that you could only hear if the room was small and quiet enough, which this room was. There was a security camera mounted in the upper corner, and the indicator light that should have been red was dark, not blinking slowly, not dimmed. Dark. Stahl set Elias's carry-on on a metal table and did not open it any further. He stood there. And Elias stood there. And 3 full minutes passed in the way that 3 minutes can pass in a room with no windows and no explanation, and a camera with no light on it, which is to say that they passed very slowly and with a great deal of weight. Stahl finally said something about how innocent men who have nothing to hide don't usually lead with questions about probable cause, and the implication of that sentence was the kind that doesn't leave the room it's set in. Diane appeared in the doorway behind him, adding her version of events, and the TSA officer, who had come with her young, early 30s name tag that said Reyes, stood behind her and said nothing, though he had been present for all of boarding and had seen everything, and he winced once, barely a flicker across his face that he couldn't quite control. Elias asked 3 times evenly whether he was being detained. The same words each time, the same unhurried tone, like a man with all the patience in the world. The 3rd time Stahl could not answer, because the honest answer was no, and saying no meant Elias could walk out, and Stahl could not construct a legal reason to prevent it. "You're free to go," Stahl said. Elias picked up his carry-on. He walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold, turned, and looked back at the camera in the corner with the dark indicator light. "That camera isn't recording," he said. "That's going to be a problem for you." Stahl looked at the camera. When he looked back, Elias was already walking out, and his wrist past the doorframe bare and plain. No watch, no gold. Nothing that needed to prove anything to anyone. The boarding line was gone. The cabin door was closed. The jet bridge was empty and quiet behind him, and Elias walked back through it and out into the terminal, and he did not look at the agents at the gate desk, and they did not look at him. And he found a metal bench at the floor-to-ceiling window that faced the tarmac, and he sat down and set his carry-on at his feet and looked at the glass. His own reflection came back to him. In it, navy suit. No tie, glasses sitting very slightly crooked from where Bryce Calderton's shoulder had connected with his. And there was something about seeing himself that way, in an airport window, on a gray morning carry-on at his feet, and a closed cabin door behind him that required a moment to simply be with, so he was with it. Flight 1140 was pulling back from the gate, the pushback crew guiding it out with their orange batons, and Elias watched the tail swing slowly out, and the engines begin to spool up with that deep-rising hum that fills the whole chest if you're close enough. And he watched the nose turn toward the taxiway. An elderly black woman in a wheelchair was being pushed past behind him, her caregiver steering her toward gate B11, and as they came level with his bench, the woman turned her head and looked at Elias directly. The way very old people sometimes look at strangers, without any of the social deflection that most of us carry around, like a habit, just a clear, full look that took him in and understood something without asking. She nodded once, slowly. He nodded back. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The wheelchair rolled on. Elias looked down at his right hand. It was shaking. A small tremor, barely visible, the kind of thing no one across the aisle would notice. But he noticed it, and he understood exactly what it was. It was 90 minutes of anger that he had been holding down in the precise, controlled way that certain people in certain situations learn to hold things down, because the alternative has costs that no one else will pay on your behalf. He flexed his fingers. He flexed them again. He pressed his palm flat against his thigh and held it there until the trembling eased. He breathed in slow. He breathed out slower. Flight 114 was at the end of the runway now, and he watched it roll, and he watched the nose come up, and he watched it climb into a sky that had gone full daylight gold while he was inside that windowless room, and he watched it until it was small and then gone. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out his phone. His thumb went to the wrong contact. First an attorney he hadn't spoken to in over a year. He backed out. He scrolled. He found Raymond Ford, and he called. Raymond picked up on the second ring. "You should be in the air." "I'm at the gate," Elias said. "They took me off the plane." The silence that followed lasted just under 3 seconds, which was the exact amount of time Raymond Ford needed to understand the full weight of what had just been said, because he had worked beside Elias Grayson for 14 years. And he knew his voice the way, a person's voice, when you have spent 14 years in high-pressure rooms listening to it. And what he heard now was something he had never heard in it before. Not anger, not even frustration, but a kind of weight that sits underneath those things and is much older than they are. Raymond did not ask why. He asked, "What do you need?" "What's our current North Star position?" $4.8 billion. "Liquidate all of it," Elias said. "VWAP execution. File the 13F amendment the same day. I want everything completed before market close." A pause longer than the last one. "Elias, all of it." "All of it." Another pause. "Are you?" Raymond stopped, recalibrated. "Are you okay?" And here, for the first and only time in this entire morning, something shifted in Elias Grayson's voice. Not much, not obviously just enough to hear, if you were listening carefully, a small, dry exhale that was almost a laugh, but wasn't quite, because it came from a place that laughter doesn't usually come from. "I'm fine," he said. "Do it now." He ended the call. He set the phone on his knee and looked at the empty runway. Far away on the 39th floor of North Star Airlines' headquarters in Dallas, A junior trading analyst named Brett Hollis was staring at his Bloomberg terminal with the particular quality of stillness that comes over a person when a number on a screen is doing something that the number should not be doing. And he said his supervisor's name in the careful voice of someone who does not want to cause alarm, but has just noticed the building is on fire. The supervisor walked over with his coffee. The coffee stopped halfway to his mouth. "That's Grayson Capital Partners," Brett said. "Yes, sir." How much? Brett swallowed. "All of it, sir." 4.8 billion. The coffee cup hit the floor, and neither of them noticed because they were both looking at the screen where the number that represented North Star Airlines' share price was already moving in a direction that nobody in that building was going to be happy about, and the moving had only just begun. The trading floor in Dallas was not a place accustomed to silence, but it went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when everyone in them has registered something simultaneously, and no one has yet found the words for it, because the words for watching your company's market value drop 9% in 11 minutes are words that tend to come slowly, if at all. Thomas Aldridge, North Star's CFO, was on his phone to the chairman's office before the number hit 11%, and his voice had the particular measured calm of a man who is using every resource he has to prevent himself from saying out loud what he is looking at, because saying it out loud makes it irrevocably real. Chairman Arthur Pennington. 64 years old, silver-haired, 9 years in the chair, walked into the trading floor and looked at the board, and his assistant handed him a printout with a name on it. And Pennington read the name and said nothing for a long moment. And then he asked someone to pull up the account. And when the profile filled the screen, he read it aloud in the quiet, careful voice of a man encountering the consequence of something he didn't know had happened. Elias Grayson, founder and CEO, Grayson Capital Partners, 40 billion under management, North Star Airlines' second largest institutional shareholder, Diamond Elite Plus designation permanent, signed by Arthur Pennington in person at a dinner in Chicago 3 years ago. The room was completely still. Pennington set the printout down. He looked at his CFO. He looked at his head of investor relations, Warren Cole, who was standing near the window and appeared to be doing the mathematics of the situation in real time and not arriving at a figure that anyone was going to enjoy. A flight attendant and a ground supervisor, Pennington said, and his voice was very steady, the way it goes. Steady when the alternative is something he cannot allow, in a room full of people watching him, threw our second largest shareholder off an airplane to give his seat to a man whose only qualification appears to be a familial connection to one of our board members. A vice president near the back of the room closed his eyes. "Get me the company jet," Pennington said. "I'm going to Atlanta." Flight 1140 was somewhere over Tennessee when Bryce Calderton called Tessa Cole back to row 2 for what she counted quietly and precisely as the 4th glass of champagne. And when she arrived, he made another remark. This one about her profile, about how she ought to consider a different career, about how a face like hers was wasted in a uniform, and Tessa's smile stayed exactly in place, carved there, held there by every muscle she had, while she poured the champagne and said of course, and walked back to the galley and stood with her back against the counter for 30 seconds and breathed. Marion Webb in seat 1B had long since stopped pretending to look at anything but Bryce Calderton. She had the black notebook out again, and she was writing in it with the deliberate precision of someone recording testimony rather than impressions. In seat 3, a Frank Delano stopped recording, checked his footage, and found it clean. The boarding pass, the shoulder collision, the child's voice, the grandfather's silence, all of it intact and clear. He looked at his phone for a moment, then opened his contacts, found the name of a friend in the union, an old partner, who knew a reporter at the Atlanta Tribune, and sent a message that said only, "Call me tonight. Something happened on my flight." The Sky Club at Concourse C smelled of espresso and the particular kind of hush that comes from people who are accustomed to quiet spaces in loud places, and Elias Grayson was on his second black coffee, the one he had not really tasted sitting in a chair by the window, with his laptop open, and 47 missed calls and a notifications panel he had stopped looking at after the 12th email marked urgent. He was not checking the stock price. He knew what it was doing. He had known what it would do before he made the call. He was writing an email to a nonprofit attorney in D.C. who specialized in federal civil rights litigation, and he was writing it the same way he wrote every important communication carefully, completely without a single word that wasn't necessary. 3 men came through the glass doors at something between a fast walk and a jog, which in a Sky Club draws attention in a way that nothing else quite does, because the fundamental social contract of a Sky Club is that urgency is performed quietly, and these men had run out of quiet. They stopped at Elias's table. He finished the sentence he was on. He hit send. Only then did he look up. Arthur Pennington stood in front of him, slightly out of breath, his silver hair less perfect than it had been in the morning, his eyes carrying the weight of a man who has been on a plane for 90 minutes, doing arithmetic that keeps coming out the same wrong way. Behind him stood Thomas Aldridge, Northstar's CFO, and Warren Cole, head of investor relations. Mr. Grayson Pennington said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the flight. "I am Arthur Pennington. I'm the chairman of Northstar Airlines. I flew in from Dallas because I had to say this in person." He paused. "Please." Elias looked at him for a moment, and then he gestured to the chair across the table, the single open chair, and said, "Sit." Pennington sat. Aldridge and Cole stood behind him, like men who no longer had a role, but hadn't been told to leave. Pennington set a leather portfolio on the table, and his hands were not entirely steady, and he opened it and turned it, so Elias could see what was inside a signed blank check, an offer letter for a permanent advisory board seat, a written commitment on Northstar letterhead to terminate Diane Foley, Victor Stahl, and any other employee Elias named, and a formal corporate apology countersigned by the board. Then, Pennington did something that surprised the handful of Sky Club travelers who were trying very hard to appear not to be watching. He stood up, walked around the table to Elias's side, and placed one hand on Elias's shoulder, gently, the way a person reaches for language when language has failed them completely. He stood there, one hand on that shoulder, and he did not speak because he had run out of things to say that weren't smaller than the situation required. Elias looked at the hand on his shoulder. He did not pull away immediately. He sat with it for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when a room is watching, and then he spoke. His voice did not rise. It did not waver. Each word came out measured and precise, the way a man speaks when he has been thinking about exactly this for the last 4 hours, and knows that he will only say it once, and needs every word to be exactly right. "Mr. Pennington," he said, "sit down." Pennington sat. "This morning, when I was sitting in seat 2A, I was not a CEO. I was not a shareholder. I was not the founder of anything. I was a black man holding a boarding pass. And that is precisely how your employees treated a black man holding a boarding pass. That is what I need you to understand, before anything else." The lounge had gone the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like quiet, because it's too full of attention. "The apology you're offering me today," Elias continued, "is not for what they did to me. It's for what they did to the man who just pulled $4.8 billion from your stock price. And those two things are not the same apology, Mr. Pennington. They are not the same thing at all." Pennington opened his mouth. Elias lifted one hand, and Pennington closed it. "The sell order completed 14 minutes before you walked through those doors. Your stock price is not my problem to solve. It is the consequence of a culture your company created and maintained and chose not to examine for 16 years. He pushed the leather portfolio back across the table back toward Pennington without looking at it. I don't want the check. I don't want the board seat. I don't need you to fire anyone to make me feel better about this morning. The courts will manage that part. He paused. The real apology, the one that would have mattered, would have been training Diane Foley differently 16 years ago, or listening to the 9 passengers who filed complaints about her before I ever set foot on that plane. You cannot go back and do that. So do not apologize to me today, Mr. Pennington. Apologize to them. He met Pennington's eyes, which were wet, now, genuinely wet, whatever that was worth, and he held them for a moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Now please get up from my table. I'm trying to finish my coffee." Aldridge put a hand on Pennington's arm. They stood. Warren Cole was already by the door. Pennington turned at the threshold and began to say something, and Elias was already looking at his laptop. When the glass doors closed behind them, Elias sat very still for a moment, and then he closed his eyes for one slow second, and under the table against his thigh, his right hand was still trembling, and nobody in the Sky Club could see it, and he pressed his palm flat and held it there, and let the trembling pass in its own time. Nora Ashby at the Atlanta Tribune opened the video file at 6:47 in the evening and watched it twice without moving, and then she called her editor and said 3 sentences, and her editor said, "How fast can you have it?" And Nora said, "Give me 2 hours," and she had it written in 90 minutes. By dinner time, the headline was live. Black billionaire CEO removed from North Star first-class stock in freefall. Within the hour, the hashtag North Star Shame was trending nationally. Within 90 minutes, a second hashtag had overtaken it, built from the exact words Diane Foley had used to describe Bryce Calderton to the entire first-class cabin, and this second hashtag was not kind. Flight 114. O had landed at JFK that afternoon, and when Diane Foley stepped off the jet bridge, 2 North Star HR officers and a corporate attorney were waiting for her at the gate, and they did not smile, and they did not greet her, and the first thing they said was that she was suspended without pay. Effective immediately, and they needed her badge and her uniform name tag. "Right now, please." She unclipped the name tag with fingers that shook enough that she had to try twice. 16 years of her name pinned to that uniform, and she handed it over, and she did not speak because there was nothing in her that was ready for words yet. 4 hours later, the suspension became a termination. By the next morning, Victor Stahl was unemployed. Warren Cole was gone by close of business. The North Star press release that afternoon used the phrase "failed to protect a core institutional relationship," and everyone in the commercial aviation industry understood precisely what that sentence was really about. 2 board members, including the cousin of Bryce Calderton, resigned before they could be formally asked to explain themselves, and their resignation letters were dated the same day and used the same template which told its own story. Tessa Cole walked into North Star's HR office on her day off and gave a complete account of everything she had witnessed, and she was specific, and she was calm, and she named Bryce Calderton, and she named every comment he had made to her and to Diane Foley and to the cabin in general in the order they occurred with the timestamps she had noted on her phone while it was happening, because something in her from the beginning of boarding had told her she was going to need to remember this precisely. She was offered protection, a promotion, and a confidential financial settlement. She took the first 2 and declined the third without hesitation because she wanted her testimony on the record and she wanted it to stay there. Captain Miles Hargrove issued a public statement through his attorney that acknowledged carefully and with a great deal of legal precision that the lead flight attendant had misled him about the nature of the incident before he spoke to the passenger. He did not say the word racism anywhere in the statement. His attorney had advised strongly against it. But anyone who read the statement understood exactly what the statement was about. Bryce Calderton called Elias's office 9 times over 3 days, and his messages moved from indignant to defensive to something that was trying to be apologetic, but couldn't quite get there. On the 3rd day, he appeared in the building lobby and demanded to be heard. And when security removed him, he resisted, and a woman walking past on Peachtree Street filmed the whole thing and posted it with a caption that spread through the internet so fast the video had 600,000 views before he got home. The Department of Transportation opened a formal civil rights investigation, and the FAA cooperated, and their particular interest was the windowless room at Gate C7 at Hartsfield-Jackson, the room with the camera whose indicator light was not on, and in what the access logs from the North Star ground operations console showed had happened to that camera at 7:51 in the morning, 4 minutes before Elias Grayson was walked through the service door. Victor Stahl's keycard was on the access log. Elias's civil suit was filed in the Northern District of Georgia with Diane Foley, Victor Stahl, Bryce Calderton, and North Star Airlines as named defendants, and the damages requested were $32 million. And when his attorneys told him to ask for more, he said no, because he already knew exactly what he intended to do with $32 million, and he had already spoken with the people who would receive it. Discovery began, and what discovery found was considerably worse than anyone outside the case had expected, because it was not just the story of one morning on one flight. It was the story of a pattern built across years, sustained by silence and protected by institutional paperwork. Diane Foley had 9 internal complaints filed against her over 7 years. Every one of them came from a passenger of color. Every one of them had been reviewed and closed by Victor Stahl using identical boilerplate language review, concluded no further action, and in several cases, the review had been completed in under 25 minutes, which is not enough time to read a complaint carefully, let alone investigate it. And then there was the text message. Subpoenaed records showed that at 7:29 on the morning of Flight 114, 22 minutes before boarding began, Diane Foley had sent a message from her personal phone to Bryce Calderton's personal phone. The message contained 3 words, "Got you a welcome." The financial records explained the 3 words. 3 months before that morning, Bryce Calderton had delivered a prepaid Visa card $1,800 to Diane Foley at a North Star employee parking garage. He had done it twice before that. He had been doing it on and off for nearly 4 years. Every single flight Bryce booked on Diane's route ended the same way: he received a seat better than the one on his ticket, and the person who had paid for that seat was moved without explanation. The 9 passengers who had filed those complaints were not bumped because of an operational need or a booking error. They were bumped because their seats had been quietly, deliberately sold to a man with enough money and the right connection to make it happen. Victor Stahl had known. The internal emails made that clear. He had been notified when Bryce's name appeared on Diane's manifests, and his complaint response times on those specific flights were the shortest of all. He had not just failed to stop it, he had protected it, and the camera he had disabled that morning had been disabled with his own keycard, 4 minutes before a man he had just detained without probable cause was walked into a room with no windows, a locked door, and no recording in progress. This was not carelessness. This was a structure built piece by piece over years that had worked without consequence, because the people it was built to harm had no recourse that anyone with power felt obligated to respond to. Until now, Federal Court, Atlanta, Judge Eleanor Marsh presiding, and the courtroom was full in the way that courtrooms are full when the case has already lived in the public mind for months and the verdict feels inevitable. But everyone needs to be present for it anyway. Elias took the stand and answered every question the same way he had spoken to Pennington in the Sky Club level. Factual measured his voice, carrying easily in the high-ceilinged room, without needing to be raised. He described what happened. In seat 2A, in the same order, it happened with the same precision he would have brought to a presentation to an investment committee. And when the defense tried to introduce ambiguity about the nature of the interaction, he waited for the question to finish, and then answered it with the same patience he had used in that windowless room. The Frank Delano video played in open court on a screen visible to the full gallery, the boarding pass being held up Bryce's shoulder, the whispered comment, and then the boy 4 rows back, looking at his grandfather with the open, honest face of a child who genuinely needs someone to explain the world to him, asking why they were making that man leave, and the grandfather who could not find an answer he was willing to say in front of his grandson, on an airplane. 3 news anchors later described on the record that the moment they cried during their broadcast was that moment. The child's voice, the grandfather's silence. Marion Webb took the stand on the second day in a suit she might have worn to any of the hundreds of boardrooms she had walked into over a 20-year consulting career, and she was precise and composed and utterly without performance. And she opened the small black notebook on the railing in front of her and read from it. Dates, seat numbers, exact words. Times. She told the court she had been keeping records like this for 11 years on every business flight she had taken because she had found over time that having a written account of what she experienced was the only thing that reliably protected her when she needed to be believed later. This was the first time she had ever been asked to read from the notebook in a legal proceeding. It was the first time anyone official had asked. A woman named Carmen Reyes testified on the same day she was not the TSA officer. She was a retired school teacher from Marietta, and she had been bumped from her seat on a North Star flight 16 months ago without explanation. And the complaint she had filed had been closed by Victor Stahl in 18 minutes. She had stopped flying North Star after that. She had also, she told the court quietly, stopped believing that filing a complaint about the way she was treated in public would ever result in anything changing, because nothing ever had. She said this without bitterness, in the manner of someone reporting a fact about the weather. Tessa Cole came in on the same day in the suit she had worn to her North Star job interview 4 months before all of this happened. And she read from one sheet of paper, and she did not cry. And when she was done, she folded the paper carefully and put it in her purse. Arthur Pennington had resigned from the North Star chairmanship the week before he testified, and he looked older than 64 on the day he took the stand, in the way that certain kinds of knowledge age a person faster than time does. He testified for an hour and 20 minutes. He said he took full personal responsibility for the culture that had allowed this to happen, and that the word culture was the right word, because the problem was not a single employee or a single flight or a single morning in Atlanta. It was the difference between what North Star wrote in its policies and what North Star actually did when no one it considered important was watching. The plaintiff's attorney asked him a single direct question. Did North Star Airlines have an anti-discrimination policy? Pennington said, on paper, yes. In practice, no. We had a policy. We did not have a culture. That was my fault. That sentence ran in every newspaper that covered the trial. Then Pennington turned in the witness chair, unprompted, unexpected, without instruction from any attorney, and he found Elias Grayson in the plaintiff's row, and he spoke directly to him, and he said that he was not here today to apologize to Elias Grayson, because Elias had been right in the Sky Club. That apology had been for the wrong reason. He was here today to apologize to the 9 Black and Latino passengers Diane Foley had mistreated before Elias ever sat down in seat 2A, and to every person of color who had flown North Star during the 16 years she worked for his airline, and to the woman from Marietta who had stopped believing complaints were worth filing, and to every person who had filed one anyway and been dismissed in under 25 minutes. He said I failed them. I have no excuse. Elias nodded once. Nothing more. There was no orchestrated forgiveness. There was no embrace. Pennington understood what the nod meant, and he sat down. The verdicts came across the following weeks, like a series of doors closing one after another, each final. North Star Airlines settled Elias's civil suit for $32 million. Elias donated every cent through a press release that was 2 sentences long. The recipient was the National Coalition for Black Air Travelers. The North Star CEO resigned. 2 more board members followed. The stock lost another 19% over the quarter. Diane Foley was permanently banned from the airline industry by the FAA. The Department of Justice indicted her for federal wire fraud in connection with the bribery arrangement. She pleaded guilty. 18 months of federal probation, $45,000 in fines, and a public licensing record that would follow her name for the rest of her working life. Victor Stahl was terminated and faced federal civil rights penalties for his years of deliberate complaint suppression. The disabled camera documented through the access logs added criminal obstruction to the civil findings. Bryce Calderton was convicted of federal bribery. He was sentenced to 13 months in federal prison. His real estate firm filed for restructuring the same week his sentencing was reported, and the restructuring did not go well. Frank Delano was profiled by the New York Times in a piece that ran under the headline, "He Pressed Record." He was photographed outside the new legal aid office on the day it opened, and standing beside him in the photograph was his brother-in-law, the postal worker in the navy blazer he had been wearing the day he was turned away from the hardware store 3 years ago. Neither of them mentioned the hardware store that day, but Frank's brother-in-law was smiling in the photograph, and the smile reached all the way to his eyes. 6 months later, a different airline, a different gate. Elias walked down the jet bridge with his carry-on in his hand, and the gate agent scanned his pass and said, "Good morning," without pausing to study his face, and the cabin smelled like coffee and warm air, and he sat down in 2A and put his bag in the overhead and put on his headphones, and across the aisle in 2B. A young black woman in a business suit looked up from her laptop and saw him and knew exactly who he was. And she nodded once, and he nodded back, and the plane pushed back from the gate into a morning that was just beginning. In Atlanta, the National Coalition for Black Air Travelers opened its first legal aid office and named it the Delano Center, after a retired firefighter who had once stayed silent at a hardware store and had spent 3 years thinking about it on Tuesdays, and on the day of the opening, Frank brought his brother-in-law, and they stood together in front of the door with the name on it, and did not say much because they didn't need to. Somewhere over Virginia, Elias opened his laptop. The sky outside the window was daylight gold. His right hand was steady. If this story moved you, if it made you think about a moment when you saw something and chose to speak or chose to stay silent, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, dignity, and the quiet power of doing what is right.